Whenever a woman provides evidence of sexual crimes against women by males who identify as transgender, she can predict the response by trans activists. First, the trans activists will call her a bigot for pointing out the sexual crimes. Next, the trans activists will deny the sexual crimes took place. After that, they'll deny the perpetrator is really transgendered and insist he's a male who uses transgender identity to facilitate his crimes. They'll insist this even when the perpetrators are prominent trans activists who've been central to passing laws granting male access to women's spaces, and even when the perpetrators have been featured in films promoting transgender ideology. From there, the trans activist fallback position is that the women are cherry-picking and that there are very few males who identify as transgender who ever break the law or hurt anyone. This is, of course, untrue. Research shows that males who identify as transgender have the same rate of criminality as males who don't. That includes the same rate of violent crimes and the same rate of sexual crimes. It includes the same rate of crimes against women. Here are a few males who, under the laws of several states, would be allowed into women's most vulnerable spaces. Decide for yourself if you think there is any reason for any woman to be concerned. In 2006, Jonathan Adrian Wolfe was convicted of raping a 20-year-old deaf woman. He is a registered sex offender. He changed his name to Johanna, moved to Seattle, and now advocates for men's rights to use women's bathrooms and locker rooms. He calls women's fear of men like himself hatred and bigotry. So a sex offender, a convicted rapist, is openly defending men's access to naked, vulnerable women and girls. In Washington state, where he lives, he is legally allowed to access, and he advocates for it. Paula Ray Witherspoon is a male who identifies as a trans woman. He was convicted of separate sexual offenses against 2 girls. In 2011, he violated his parole by sending nude photos of himself over the internet. In 2012, a female patient was in the women's bathroom at a local hospital when Witherspoon walked in. The frightened woman called the police. Witherspoon was charged with disorderly conduct. He is a serial sexual predator who is wearing a GPS tracking device on his ankle because he is considered high risk for reoffending. But if women and girls fear him in our vulnerable spaces, we are called bigots. Sandy Jo Batista was born David McGarry Jr. He began sexually assaulting and torturing girls when he was a teenager. At 14, he assaulted a 6-year-old girl. At 15, he kidnapped another. He was held in a juvenile facility for 3 years until he aged out and was released. At 21, he kidnapped a 10-year-old girl, tied her up, gagged her, raped her, then abandoned her in the forest. He was apprehended and pleaded guilty to kidnapping, child rape, and robbery. He served 18 years in prison. While incarcerated, he made obscene phone calls to children whose photos he saw in the newspaper. When his cell was searched, guards discovered he was collecting pictures of girls. He was transferred to the Massachusetts Treatment Center for Sexually Dangerous Persons, where he was being held indefinitely because of the danger he poses to society. In 2005, Batista sued the Massachusetts Department of Corrections to provide so-called sex change treatment for inmates. The mega law firm of McDermott, Will, and Emery, which annually generates over $1.5 million in profits per partner, represented him pro bono for 6 years and ultimately won. The legal precedent has allowed other men who have raped, otherwise tortured, and murdered women to get so-called sex change treatments at taxpayer expense. This serial predator, who has been deemed too dangerous to let into society, is defended by the transgender community, writes another transgender male. At the age of 21, he apparently raped a 10-year-old girl. However, I cannot find anything online that describes this in any detail. Was it real forcible rape? Was it statutory but consensual? Was it mainly a misunderstanding? The various mentions online say nothing between these options, nor do they say anything that would imply that McGarry was a predatory pedophile. How many girls would Batista have to rape for it to count as rape? And how young would they have to be for predators and their supporters to abandon the word consent as meaningless? And women aren't supposed to notice or care when these men are in our bathrooms? In 1997, Ronnie Edward Darnell repeatedly raped a 13-year-old girl. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of rape and 1 count of forcible sodomy and is now serving a 50-year prison sentence. He changed his name to Phoebe Hollowell and filed a lawsuit in federal court, arguing that by not providing him with hormone treatments and laser hair removal, the Oklahoma Corrections Department is subjecting him to cruel and unusual punishment. Luke Voice is a man who identifies as a woman named Laura, and whose legal identification now lists him as female. He was convicted of possessing child pornography showing children being sexually penetrated by adults. He should have been sentenced to prison, but the judge refused explicitly because Voice identifies as transgender, saying, "Frankly, you deserve to go to prison, but I can't bring myself to send you to prison, entirely because I think prison would be an appalling experience for you." The judge made no comment as to whether being raped for pornography was an appalling experience for the children whose photos Luke Voice downloaded and consumed for his own sexual gratification. Richard Masbruch has a long history of violent crime. As a teenager, he was found guilty of arson, and he went on to serve time for theft. When he was 23, he invaded the home of two women, Mary Coop and her mother Marietta. He held them at gunpoint, tied them up, blindfolded them, tortured them with electric shocks, and raped and sodomized Mary. Marietta was permanently injured by the electric shocks. Mary said it was the most excruciating pain you could think of. Masbruch was found guilty of rape, sodomy, false imprisonment, torture, and inflicting great bodily harm. He was sentenced to serve 2 consecutive life terms for the torture counts, as well as 45 years for the other crimes. While in prison, Masbruch tried several times to castrate himself. He finally used acid from the prison kitchen, and the prison was forced to hire surgeons to deal with the wounds. He now calls himself Sherry. Prison officials gave in to his demands for hormone treatments. He was then declared female and transferred to the California Institute for Women. Female inmates and their families were terrified. Inmate Patricia Wright filed a formal grievance. In her words, "It is not right to force us women to live with a male offender who has been convicted of heinous crimes against women. I have a human right to a reasonable expectation of safety." A petition to protect the women states, "Masbruch is in fact still raping women within the facility, just now with foreign objects. He has also brutally injured some of the women within the facility." A man in prison for life for rape and torture is given access to a captive population of women and predictably continues his career of rape and torture, and the women who complain are called bigots. Noel Crompton was born in 1964. In 1987, he picked up a hitchhiker named Lynn Saunders. Crompton shot Saunders in the back, and when that didn't kill him, put a shotgun in Saunders's mouth and blew off the back of his head. Crompton was arrested 18 months later and sentenced to life in prison. From there he announced to the world that he suffered from gender identity disorder and was in fact a woman named Madison Hall. With the support of trans activists and ultimately the prison administration, he was transferred to a women's prison, where he began hormone treatments. He also began raping female inmates. He raped the woman forced to share a cell with him, and he raped multiple other female inmates, knowingly exposing all of these women to HIV. He was transferred back to a men's prison, at which point he sued the Department of Corrective Services for psychological trauma. He received $25,000. He used this to fund so-called gender reassignment surgery. He became the poster child for the Gender Center, a publicly funded transgender advocacy and service provider. The Gender Center has provided no advocacy or services to the women raped by this man, at least one of whom, on hearing of his parole, fled the country, fearing for her life. Dana McCullum is a man who identifies as a woman. He has been listed as one of the top 10 most important LGBT people in tech, and has spoken at length about his transition. In 2014, he was married but getting a divorce. Soon after his wife was served with the divorce papers, he showed up at her house uninvited and raped her. Their 3 children, as well as one other child, were at home during this assault. He was arrested and later given many opportunities to apologize, or even to ask about his wife's welfare. He refused to do so. His wife, who had been demonized by trans activists and their allies for reporting the rape, said of these trans activists and their allies, "It's a shame that they can't do the emotional work it requires to process that someone they love is capable of such an awful crime. That is their burden to carry, though." When Jeffrey Ian Webstale was 21, he had a one-night stand with a woman. When she rejected his subsequent sexual advances, he kicked down the door of a cottage where she was staying. He shot and wounded her, shot a man whom he left quadriplegic, and shot and killed a man and a woman. In prison, Jeffrey began fashioning his prison uniform into a skirt and demanded to be called Michelle. Newspapers now referred to him as a woman. He was recently paroled, despite the fact that throughout his incarceration, he made threats against the families of those he killed or attempted to kill. In many states in the U.S., he would be allowed free access to women's restrooms and locker rooms, and any women or children who did not want him in their restroom or locker room would be branded bigots. Paul Denyer stalked, raped, murdered, and mutilated at least 3 women. After he was arrested, police asked why he did this. He replied, "I just hate them. I hate them all." The police asked, "These particular girls or women in general?" His reply, "General." He now identifies as transgender. Guards illicitly provide him with makeup, and against prison orders he also wears a bra and jewelry. So far, prison officials are refusing to house him with women or allow him to have so-called gender reassignment surgery. But he has the support of many trans activists who say that he is now a woman in an all-men's prison, and it's really hard on her. She appreciates male support and friendship. She's extremely understanding. Not surprisingly, the relatives of his victims do not perceive him as understanding, and have said explicitly that they do not support his efforts to identify as a woman. Davina Ayrton is a 35-year-old man who identifies as a transgender woman. He is in prison for arson, possessing child pornography, and for raping a 15-year-old girl. Because of the attack, his victim has said that she has lived in fear all the time. So far, Davina is being held in a male prison, but trans activists are arguing, as they have for other violent male sex offenders, for him to be transferred to a women's prison. Further, even though Davina confessed to the rape, trans activists have sometimes argued that no rape occurred. In 1976, Vance Egglestone was arrested for an extremely violent rape. He was found to be insane and confined to a mental institution. He was conditionally released 10 years later. Soon after, he raped and nearly murdered another woman and was reinstitutionalized. By 2000, he identified as a woman named Shauna Taylor and was blaming his gender identity disorder for the rapes and other violence. "I was a female trapped inside a male's body," he said. "I started acting out in ways I thought a male was supposed to act. My head was in a spin back then." He began taking female hormones, had no surgery, and $15,000 worth of permanent hair removal. He also sued the Canadian government to pay for amputation of his penis and testicles. One of his victims commented that while officials have spent thousands of dollars arguing over how to fund this serial rapist's requests for treatments, no one has shown any concern for his victims. "This psychopath was only out a few months when he attacked me. It was a conditional release. What were the conditions? Call us if you feel the urge to rape. And what was I when they released him? Their test subject? And isn't that what we all are? Where is the concern for women in all of this discussion? It is nowhere to be found." The first woman Wolfgang Schmidt killed was in 1989. He murdered her as she was planting tulips in her garden. Schmidt killed again the following spring, raping and murdering a woman whose body he dumped, along with a pair of pink underwear that did not belong to her, in a junkyard. He raped and killed another woman the following year. 9 days later, he found a woman walking through a forest with her 3-month-old son in a stroller. He grabbed the child, bashed out his brains against a tree, then gagged the woman with a bra and strangled her to death. 2 weeks later, he tried to snatch 2 girls from a path in the forest, but they fought him off. As the girls were reporting this to the police, Schmidt invaded the home of a woman, strangled her to death, then raped her corpse. A few months later, 2 men were walking through the forest when they encountered a man masturbating while wearing a bra. They seized Schmidt and handed him over to police. Schmidt was sentenced to prison for the rapes and murders. While in prison, he raped a transsexual prisoner. He gained the nickname the Pink Giant because of his size and because of his penchant for women's pink underwear. He has successfully petitioned the court to be referred to as a woman and to have his name changed to Beata. He is advocating for so-called gender reassignment surgery but has yet to receive permission. He has, however, been granted the right to take hormones. Schmidt has complained that other prisoners tease him for this, saying the other prisoners are nasty to me. They say I could get a fat ass. That hurts. Then I have to cry. I cry a lot now, but it helps me. I feel more feminine inside. Over several months in 1989 and 1990, Randall Donald Rye repeatedly sexually assaulted a 5-year-old girl. By 2009, he identified as a woman named Susan Elizabeth Rye. The state of Utah allowed him to change the sex listed on his driver's license from male to female. In 2012, his victim came forward, fearing he had raped other little girls. After a 14-month investigation, he was arrested and charged. At the time of his arrest, Rye was writing a novel about incest and the sexual abuse of children. This novel was disturbing enough to cause investigators to comment that an earlier psychosexual evaluation had not gone into enough depth to tell us how dangerous Rye really is. He pleaded guilty. Under many state laws, it would be perfectly legal for this male to share bathrooms and locker rooms with little girls the same age as the one he raped. In many states, women who objected to his presence could be subject to punishment. Sean Paul Gossman had been living as a woman for 7 years when he was convicted of having almost 3,000 images and videos of child porn on his computer. He told police he wanted for the videos to be true acts of children being raped and otherwise sexually abused, as opposed to simulations of these horrific acts. The pornography included bestiality, and one of the photos depicted a dead infant with a noose around its neck. His defense attorney argued for the minimum sentence, stating, "The idea of being placed in a male facility is somewhat frightening for Sean Gossman, as he has been taunted and made to feel like a freak by other inmates." Also, the attorney argued, a long sentence would carry the risk of him being exposed to potential danger and victimization. Do you think that as he watched those videos, Sean Gossman ever once had any empathy that the real children being raped might have been frightened? Not frightened because they were being taunted and made to feel like a freak, but frightened because their worst nightmares had come true and been videotaped for someone else to watch for his own sexual gratification. And do you think that as he watched those videos, Sean Gossman ever once had any empathy that these children were not being exposed to potential danger and victimization, but were being exposed to real danger and victimization, all so he could get off? In 1972, when he was 23, William Carl Olson used a handgun to force his way into a 27-year-old woman's car. They struggled and he fled. He was soon arrested and jailed. The next year he kidnapped 2 teenage girls and drove them to an isolated area. He pushed one 75 feet down a ravine and hogtied the other. He then found the girl he'd pushed down the ravine. She was profusely bleeding. He threatened her with a knife, then untied the first girl, and the 2 of them carried the bleeding girl back to the vehicle. The girls asked why he was doing this, and he said it was because he was going to rape them. Then he changed his mind and drove them home. A month later he kidnapped another woman, and again took her to an isolated place. He tore off her blouse, threw her on his truck bed, and raped her. After the rape he apologized to her, then drove her to the hospital, where he checked himself into the psychiatric unit. He was incarcerated. After his release, he kidnapped yet another teenager, took her to an isolated spot, and physically assaulted, raped, and sodomized her. Afterwards, he apologized. Soon after, he did this again, and then again. After that, he was finally incarcerated again. Olson claims he perpetrated these actions because of his own unresolved gender identity issue. That is, because he is a man who believes he is a woman. At least one psychologist concurred, saying that Olson committed the sexual assaults to displace his anger about his gender identity. Olson refers to himself as a woman, and is listed as such in legal and scholarly discussions of transgender prisoners. John D. Babcock is a man who identifies as a transgender woman. He calls himself Sarah Babcock. He is allowed to be a Girl Scout leader. He used this position to sexually assault young girls. He was convicted of assaulting 6 girls and 1 boy. He calls himself transgender, and the transgender press claims him as such. He has been released from prison and is on parole. He lives in Washington State, where he is legally allowed to use women's restrooms and locker rooms. This despite the fact that he is classified as a Level 3 sex offender, meaning he is considered by law enforcement officials as being highly likely to reoffend. Yet women who object to his presence in locker rooms and restrooms are considered bigots. Jason LaPrey was 14 when he kidnapped and raped an 8-year-old girl. He now identifies as a woman named Katerina LaPrey. Trans activists around the country have accepted him as one of their own and have supported him in his demands of the prison system. Brian Woodall is a man who believes he's a woman. Before he killed his wife, Christine, he used to routinely beat her. Bruises would often cover her back, legs, and face. He would tell her, "If you leave me, I will kill your father and your whole family and make you watch, and then I'll kill you." When she would come home from work on Fridays, he would lock her in a room with her dogs and not let any of them out until Monday, when he would send her to work. In the home she had one small dresser for her clothes, and he had 5 closets full of lingerie. Only one of Christine's friends ever came to visit her. She was allowed to visit, as the friend said, because I didn't say anything about him dressing like a woman. I didn't act like it was strange. But she would coach me before she took me in. Don't look him in the eyes, compliment him on his nail polish and his looks. She didn't think it was safe for me to go in there unless I had been coached. After a time, Brian was able to arrange for a so-called sex change operation, but it fell through, so he told his wife that she needed to cut off his genitals. He bought a scalpel, other medical equipment, and a soldering iron so she could cauterize the wound. She refused to mutilate him and left the room to cook him some food. He called her back, shot her in the face, and killed her. He was sentenced to prison. While there, he was beaten by guards. He sued the state of New York and received $80,000. Please note that his wife never received a penny for the times he beat her. He served 8 years and is now out of prison, living as Misty Lacroix. He is active in the local transgender community, and he has a page on the transgender wiki that mentions him being imprisoned and beaten by prison guards, but of course makes no mention of how he held his wife captive for years, how he beat her, or how he murdered her. He is legally allowed to use women's locker rooms, and women who object to his presence are subject to penalties. By his own admissions, Matthew Ralph Harks has sexually assaulted 60 girls, keeping trophies of his sexual assaults. He served 3 years in prison for sexually assaulting a 6-year-old girl. Within weeks of his release, he was found to have pornography on his computer. His release was temporarily revoked, and then he was released again. Soon after, he changed his name to Madeline Rebecca Harks. The province of British Columbia now legally recognizes him as a woman. So do newspapers. So must anyone who does not wish to violate Canadian law, which demands that everyone call men like Matthew Harks women. Raymond Crawford Tan went to prison for raping a child. He has since been released from prison. He identifies as a woman and now goes by the name Raquel Desbonnets. In many states, he would be able to legally enter women's bathrooms and locker rooms. Women or girls who objected to his presence would be subject to punishment. Between the ages of 30 and 45, David Scott Teeter repeatedly raped both a 13 and a 10-year-old girl. At the time of his arrest, he went by the name Heather Teeter and identified as a transgender woman. He too would be allowed to legally enter a restroom or locker room with vulnerable girls. Jacobus Marinus Mark van Neerup has confessed to killing his first wife. He is better known for being called the dentist of horror. He intentionally mutilated the mouths of more than 100 of his patients, pulling out healthy teeth, intentionally causing abscesses and septicemia, breaking jaws, and refusing to give patients pain medication. When asked about the suffering of his patients, he responded, "It does not affect me." He also said, "I'm totally blocked from the inside and I don't want to explain it at all." He has been diagnosed as being narcissistic and borderline. He identifies as transgender and is labeled as such by the press, especially in Canada, where he was arrested and where it is required by law that he be identified as a woman, because that is what he claims to be. Since his arrest, he has gone on hunger strikes and swallowed razor blades in attempts to not have to talk to a judge. As James Dilbeck was raping a woman, stealing her wedding ring from her finger, and burning her with a cigarette, he said to her that he felt like a woman trapped in a man's body, and told her he was raping her because he was so angry and conflicted about not having a woman's body. A psychological report compiled after he was arrested found he had gender identity disorder and antisocial behavior. In many states, he would be allowed into women's restrooms and locker rooms, and women would not be allowed to stop him. Louis Stevens, a man who identifies as a woman and goes by the name Linnea Elizabeth Stevens, was convicted of possessing child pornography, including numerous videos of adult males raping prepubescent girls. In prison, he is supported by the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, a transgender advocacy organization which publishes his blogs about the difficulties of being a woman in a man's prison. Jeffrey Wilsey was convicted of both first- and second-degree sexual assault. He is a registered sex offender and classified as a sexually violent offender. He identifies as a woman and now goes by the name Zena M. Grandicelli. He is a member of the previously mentioned transgender advocacy group, the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. Here is what he writes on a dating site. "I'm here to find that special woman to be with for life, Men need not to contact me because I am a true lesbian, and am looking for that special woman only, not men. I said no men, and I mean this. Men need not apply, period. I am a true lesbian looking for only women, no men, period. I am only into women. So all the men need to stop trying to contact me here now, only interested in women. What is amazing, apart from the fact that he's a man who claims he's a lesbian, is that he's allowed to draw a line, no men, period. At the same time, he actively campaigns to disallow women from drawing that same line. Walter Miller identified as a woman. When his therapist told him that she didn't think he was ready to surgically transition, he shot and killed this single mother of two, then killed himself. Jerry Brudos is known as the shoe fetish killer. He attacked women while wearing women's clothes. In fact, that's how he got caught. A witness reported seeing a man dressed as a woman in the vicinity of one of his attacks and thought it was suspicious. Today, that witness would be shamed as a bigot and a vicious serial killer would go free. Brudos would kidnap women, bring them to his home, force them to put on black lingerie, take pictures of them, torture and kill them, then rape their corpses. Here is a photo he took of one of his victims. He killed her by hanging her from a hook in his ceiling, then raped her body and cut off her breasts, which he used as paperweights. Brudos killed 4 women before he was caught. Police found containers full of stolen underpants, slips, and bras in his garage. They also found a severed woman's foot still wearing one of the high heels he loved so much. We'll end this video the same way we ended the last one, and we can keep ending videos this way until people truly understand that though we will be accused of cherry-picking the worst of the worst, we did not. This video could have been hours long. For each offender here, there are many more. And for each offender, there are victims. There are women and children who have been terrorized, violated, and even murdered. Yet these men and their advocates keep telling us that this never happens, that men who wear women's clothing never commit sexual crimes, and that women have no right to privacy, no right to safety, and no reason to fear. Decide for yourself.